Good afternoon. And thank you, Suzanne, for that very warm welcome. And thanks to you and your colleagues for your incredible stewardship of this magical place called Presidio. And to Stephen Swig and Dick Gray for your incomparable vision that has made this all possible. And to my friend William Shutkin for your extraordinary, inimitable leadership. You have an indefatigable commitment to this remarkable institution, and you have many friends here in this room and all across this country because of the achievements of Presidio. So to the deans and faculty and staff, to the proud family who is gathered today, and the friends of the graduates, and of course, to the class of 2015, I say congratulations. So let me say, before we dive in here, that this is a little unusual for me. I do about 3 commencement addresses a year, and this is not a typical commencement address, because Presidio is not a typical business school. And that's why I was excited to come here today. So I will say that it is probably the only business school commencement I'll ever do in my career at the Ford Foundation, and that is because what happens at Presidio is simply magic. And what I want to talk to you today about is something that many of you know, and that's one of the challenges of talking to you and giving you advice, because this podium is not a platform for some wise old man to offer advice to young and energetic leaders of tomorrow, because first, I'm not old, but more importantly, you guys are already doing it. Many of you have come to Presidio because you've learned that you want to change the world, and you know that with a Presidio degree, you are empowered to change the world. When I talk at commencement addresses and when I talk in general about sustainable businesses, I often have to explain to people what I'm talking about. But you already know that. You already know why sustainability is important. I sometimes have to share a perspective on how organizations and institutions can make more sustainable choices. But you all already know that. So in light of this, and in light of all that you all have already achieved, I'm going to jettison some of the traditional formula for a commencement address and just say that I want to talk to you today about the bridge between where we are as a society and where we need to be, and the unique role that you all as graduates of Presidio can help us to do to achieve that goal. Because while the work never stops being rewarding, it never gets easier. Because we're dealing, and you are dealing, with a complex, shifting set of issues, all emerging from and evolving in a dialogue with the underlying crisis in our society of inequality. Because for my part, I believe that along with climate change, inequality is the greatest threat to our democracy and our society. We see inequality in our economy, in our culture, in our politics, and in our civic participation. And this is not just unjust, it's wholly unsustainable. And as Suzanne said, I spent some time in the private sector on Wall Street before leading an NGO in Harlem in the 1990s. And this experience has led me to want to understand the intersection of markets and social justice. That's what you all are all about at Presidio. And at the Ford Foundation, we've began a conversation about this intersection. And we've asked some questions. Can capitalism have a conscience? How can we make capitalism work for good? And The question, can and where markets lead, can justice follow? The answer we have learned is put in 3 words, and those words are, it can if. It can if our businesses strive to optimize all kinds of value, not just values of shareholder return, but values that are environmental and cultural, values that are about community and community building. It can if we invest based not on short-term gain, but also on long-term good. It can if we learn to resist the impulse to define every element of our lives and our culture in relation to capital. It can if we stop elevating market-oriented thinking above all other categories of human understanding. And it can if we think about markets and human dignity not as competing priorities, but as complementary ones. So the NGO I worked for in Harlem was a community development organization. And during my time there, we saw lots of engagement with social policy experts. These experts would speculate about the concerns of the residents of Harlem without actually spending any time talking to people in Harlem. But they had the best of all intentions. But they tried to impose social change on the neighborhood without sufficient regard to the people in the neighborhood. This is a textbook example of what the eminent economist William Easterly calls the tyranny of experts. And the tragic irony is that if these experts had simply listened and not lectured, they might have learned that the biggest issues on Harlem residents' minds at that time was not a lack of some complicated rights-based theory of change. It was the lack of a supermarket. Because you see, in 1995, Harlem was a food desert. Even though the city, the community was the size of a city, there were over 500,000 residents in Harlem. There was no supermarket. And the residents believed here they sat on Manhattan Island in the beacon of capitalism, and they didn't have something as basic as affordable, decent food. That was the social justice issue they wanted to prioritize. And so in the 1990s, my organization set about bringing that first full-service supermarket, something so basic and so simple, but yet so challenging to achieve in that community. And when we did it, it helped really to usher in a new era, breaking that bottleneck of development that no technocratic development plan could do. And we helped to create an environment that became really a virtuous cycle of development. The media wrote more and more about the community became more and more desirable. And what did I learn from this experience? What I learned was the importance of being disruptive and the importance of building bridges. Because too often we retreat to our separate ideological corners. On one side are those who are exclusively rights-oriented, who believe that poor communities deserve certain benefits and protections to make the system more equal and fair, and that markets need to be heavily regulated. On the other side are neocon conservative economists and business advocates who believe that the only way to advance development is through market-based approaches, and we should allow the invisible hand of the markets to sort everything out. In their view, economic growth is the solution to every problem. But the truth is, after decades of experimentation, we know that each of these arguments has merit. Each camp has the data and the metrics to affirm the rightness and the righteousness of their cause. And so today, I believe it's more incumbent upon us, each of us, to find ways to draw on new ideas, new practices that are both community sustainability oriented and market-based approaches, not one or the other. But we need to create a new paradigm that embraces each simultaneously. And this indeed does require us to build bridges. I saw this dynamic play out recently in the city of Detroit, a place that is very special to me and the Ford Foundation. I'm sure many of you have heard about the largest municipal bankruptcy in America's history, the city of Detroit's bankruptcy. And so my colleagues at the foundation and I and at other foundations found ourselves in a really challenging predicament. At one end of the spectrum, we saw billionaires lining up to strip down and sell off the Detroit Institute of the Arts. The city owns that museum. And they saw the museum as creditors. They saw the museum as an asset that they wanted to monetize and to liquidate. The city had so many liabilities that it simply was essential that it sell as many assets as it could. And the judge in the bankruptcy said that this would need to happen. But we also had, on the other side, retirees whose pensions were underfunded. And plenty of people along these many years, political leaders especially, weren't straight up and straightforward with the residents and those retirees, promising them benefits and not funding them fully. This led to endless red ink and contributed to the city's fiscal crisis. So the question for us was, how do we help to save Detroit? And more importantly, how do we ensure that Detroit is a city worth saving? And the answer, like the answer in Harlem, was that we had to jettison our blind alliance to only one way of thinking, and instead to build bridges, to forge a grand bargain in which everyone gave more than they wanted, but we helped to save the city. And we can save Detroit if we think about this not in one way, but think about it in multiple ways. Think about it in an interdisciplinary way, in an intersectional way. We can save Detroit and many of America's great cities if we build bridges. And so here in San Francisco, I am always, when I visit, struck by the majesty of this city. As a hardcore New Yorker who thinks that there's no place else better in the world to live than New York City, when I come to San Francisco, to be honest, I am challenged. My arrogance and my sense of feeling about New York is challenged when I come here. And I see in this city all sorts of treasures, and of course, the Golden Gate Bridge. And this beautiful bridge is the perfect emblem, not just for Presidio, but for everything I'm talking about today. So let me close by getting at this from a slightly different angle and bridge. As many of you know, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement's Bloody Sunday. So back in March, I was privileged to attend this deeply moving celebration and memorial in Selma. And I got to visit and travel with my personal hero, John Lewis, the congressman who marched on this bridge in 1965 as a 25-year-old kid. John yearned desperately for a better world, and he was willing to put his life on the line. And he didn't just cross that bridge, he built a bridge. He and a generation of heroes marching in unison bridged the divide between an America that had failed to fulfill its promise and an America in which a black gay kid from a poor family in rural Texas could grow up to be president of the Ford Foundation. John's work made my work today possible. And you, each of you graduates, like John Lewis, you are crossing a bridge, and you are building a bridge between the country we are and the country you know we ought to be. A bridge between the economic concerns that too often dominate our stale and tired public discourse and the social, cultural, and environmental concerns that comprise a new constellation of business imperatives for this century. A bridge between the status quo and a new paradigm. Bridges that we desperately need, now more than ever. And as Dr. King admonished us, one of the great tragedies in life is that people seldom bridge. They seldom bridge the gulf between practice and profession, between doing and saying. Your challenge is, how do you contribute to transcending these gulfs? What are you doing at Presidio? What you are doing is helping to amplify and proselytize this new paradigm for the world. How do you take the best practices that you have learned here as students and bring it to your places of employment? No matter what kind of organization you work for, you have the opportunity to be a bridge. And this will be ongoing, because just like the Golden Gate Bridge, the work never seems to stop. And ultimately, I have faith, more faith than ever, that our future is a sustainable one. Or maybe what I should say is, it can be if you make the small compromises that usher in big change, if you negotiate your own grand bargains and build your own grand bridges, if together we commit to ensuring that social justice and economic growth are not mutually exclusive, but rather mutually reinforcing, mutually beneficial. Class of 2015, today, as you depart this remarkable jewel, this inimitable place called the Presidio Graduate School, think about the bridges you are going to build into the future. Your future is here. Your future is now. Congratulations. I'm honored to have had this opportunity to speak to you today.